I am Will Fenton, Director of Research and Public Programs at the Library Company of Philadelphia. I suspect that many of you have heard of us. Maybe you've done some research at our institution. We are actually open in a very limited capacity right now. We are an independent research library that was originally founded by Benjamin Franklin in 1731. Over the past, 290 years, we've evolved a bit. Today, we are an independent research library that specializes in early American print culture, literature, history, ephemera, and of course, we have very strong programs in visual culture, women's history, and political economy and business history. This is our seminar series, reconstituted for the COVID era. That means it's fully online. This has unique affordances and limitations. The affordance being that we can offer it to anyone in the world that can show up, find our link, and do it for free. Limitation being, of course, that I can't welcome you into the library company, and of course, our seminar leader can't pull materials from the collection and share them around our reading room. But I promise we will resume that practice as soon as we're able. But in the meantime, I think that this is a sort of interesting approach. And I'm delighted that so many people have decided to set aside a little bit of their Wednesday evening to join us. So you are in the first of a 3-session seminar on John Dickinson and the making of the US Constitution. And we have a very special seminar leader. Dr. Jane E. Calvert is the founding director and chief editor of the John Dickinson Writings Project and associate professor of history at the University of Kentucky. Her publications on Dickinson include Quaker Constitutionalism and the Political Thought of John Dickinson, and Volume 1 of the Complete Writings and Selected Correspondence of John Dickinson. She is currently writing a biography of him. Her work is funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the National Historical Publications and Records Commission, the state of Delaware, the Harry and Lynn Bradley Foundation, the William Nelson Cromwell Foundation, the American Philosophical Society, and of course, most importantly, most formatively, the Library Company of Philadelphia. So before I turn this over to her, I just want to acknowledge that this is a Zoom webinar. Your camera is not enabled, which I consider a luxury living on Zoom these days, as I'm sure many of you do. That doesn't mean that you can't participate, however. There's a Q&A feed where you can see each other's questions, you can upvote one another's questions, and you can log your own questions. And I encourage you, as you're listening to this rich discussion, to submit your question as soon as you think of it before it disappears. The other option is to raise your hand. We'll have a small section of time at the end of this seminar where you can participate. And if you raise your hand, I'll do my best to grant you speaking privileges, and you can ask your question the old-fashioned way. So with that, let me pass it over to Dr. Calvert.
Thank you, Will. First of all, I just want to thank Will for the invitation. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk about Dickinson. And I also would like to thank the Library Company for hosting this and the really wonderful support that the staff gives to programs like these. So when Will initially approached me about doing this, he asked me to lead a seminar on the Constitution. I don't consider myself an expert on the Constitution per se. I'm an expert on Dickinson. So I came back at him and said, well, why don't we do a seminar that covers Dickinson in the constitutional era? Along with that, I thought, it would be really much more informative if I would bring in guests who could provide some specific information on the topics apart from Dickinson. This is the first, as Will mentioned, of a 3-part seminar. Tonight, my guest is Liz Covart, who is from the Omohundro Institute, and she's also the very widely known host of the podcast Ben Franklin's World. And so she's working on a book project on the Confederation period. So I thought she'd be a perfect person to bring in for this session. The next session is on November 4th, and that is going to be on the Constitutional Convention. And the guest is Pulitzer Prize winning historian Jack Rakove. Then on November 18th is the third session, and that's going to be on the ratification of the Constitution with John Kaminsky, who is the co-editor of the documentary history of the ratification of the Constitution. So I'm really excited about all of these guests. Before we get started, I'd just like to say a few words sort of by way of introducing the subject. First, I'd like to say something about what it means to be an expert on John Dickinson. So he was one of the most active and prolific contributors to the founding, but unlike the other major figures at the time, his papers haven't been collected and published in a scholarly edition. So I founded the John Dickinson Writings Project to do just that. And as Will mentioned, Volume 1 came out this summer. It's called the Complete Writings and Selected Correspondence of John Dickinson, and it's published with University of Delaware Press. And then we'll be coming out with Volume 2 early into 2021. But even with Volume 2, where we are right now, that only takes us through 1763. So that's a long ways off from our time period that we're covering in these seminars. So this all means that even though I may know more about Dickinson than anybody, there's still a lot that we don't know. And every day we're learning more about his life and his work and his political thought. We're making fascinating discoveries on a daily basis. So this is all to say that the purpose of this seminar is to show you some of what we already know and to give you an idea of the richness of the sources and the materials and the potential for new scholarship. And I am sure there will be more really great questions than I have answers. So our time tonight is going to be divided into roughly 3 segments. There'll be some introductory comments from me, then a conversation between Liz Covart and me, and then we'll open it up to audience questions. So, and you'll have to excuse me, I am looking down at some notes here so I don't go completely off the rails. So to begin, just a little bit about Dickinson. He was born November 13th, 1732 in Maryland to Quaker parents. He was raised in Delaware, which was at the time the 3 lower counties of Pennsylvania. And when he was 18, he went to Philadelphia to study with John Moland. And then he traveled to London to go to the Middle Temple, which was part of the Inns of Court. That was really the legal heart of the British Empire at the time. And very few Americans actually were able to travel there and get that kind of legal training. When he returned, he immediately started practicing law and made a name for himself fairly quickly. He then joined, he was elected to the Delaware legislature in 1759, and the next year he was elected Speaker of the Assembly. By 1763, he was a rising star in the Pennsylvania Assembly. And I should note here that Pennsylvania was, of course, a Quaker colony. Its culture, politics, economics was dominated by Quakerism. And we'll return to this point in a moment. As a Pennsylvania legislature, he began to make an international name for himself as an orator. When the Stamp Act crisis began in 1765, he became known around the colonies as he was the de facto leader of the Stamp Act Congress, and he was a pamphleteer for American resistance. And from this point on, he was the only leading figure who was present and active on the domestic scene for the entire founding era. And in his activities, he wrote more than any other figure for the American cause and served in every major body. And so the documents that he wrote were state papers and many articles and pamphlets to the ordinary people in order to educate them about their rights and resistance. So in 1767, he really launched into international celebrity when he published his famous letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. So this was 67, 68. And from that point on until Americans shifted towards independence, he was really seen as the leader of the resistance to Britain. And as we'll discuss in the seminar, after independence, he didn't fade away as a lot of scholarship would have it. He remained one of the key figures throughout the Confederation period and through ratification, and even beyond into issues of the early Republic. And so, as most of you know, he did not want independence, and he absented himself from the vote rather than vote against the Declaration. Because this moment in his career has received kind of an outsized attention, I purposely didn't want to discuss that in this seminar. For people who are interested in this, very interesting aspect of his career, I refer you to the readings that are in the syllabus. So now I'd like to turn to our topic for this evening. To get into understanding the creation of the Articles of Confederation and the Confederation period, and then we'll also end up touching on the Annapolis Convention. It's important to first understand a little bit about the theories of government that were circulating at the time, and then informed the thinking of this founding generation. So I'd like to hand it over to Liz and let her give you kind of an overview of the ideologies at the time.
Thanks, Jane, and thanks for having me. Yeah, there were really a lot of different ideologies when it came to government and during this early period. I don't want to say the United States because it's still the 13 British colonies, but someone like John Dickinson would have come across things like Whig republicanism, English common law tradition, especially because he studied at the Inns of Court, scientific rationalism. We know the Enlightenment and what is going on at that point, as well as classic political thought. So, the framers of the Constitution, scholars have definitely shown were really well versed in ideas about what happened in Rome and Greece and what was happening in the Swiss Confederacy and what was happening with the Dutch Republic and around the world, that they didn't just come up with governments out of thin air, so to speak. And it seems like Dickinson, sometimes you see some of these figures having one or two influences, but really a particularly strong influence on them when it came to their constitutional thought. But it seems like Dickinson had a lot of it, like a lot of different influences, Jane.
Yeah, and I would say that most of the leading figures were informed by all of these things that you mentioned. And then there was another factor as well that doesn't get as much attention in the scholarship, but is really important, and that's religion. Dickinson certainly was, he read widely in continental and classical political thought, and he was, had this very strong legal background. But most Americans were informed by religion, but theirs was a reformed Calvinism, a Calvinist theology. And so they were Congregationalists and Presbyterians and or Anglicans. What sets Dickinson apart, and if he put forth such interesting ideas that didn't comport with what his colleagues were doing. So we have to ask why was what he offered different? And the answer to that is that he was the only major figure who was influenced by Quaker theology. And so I want to examine that just briefly for a minute, but I also want to be very clear. Dickinson was not a Quaker. He was a fellow traveler. And what I mean by that is that he was not an official member of the meeting. He was someone who was raised in a Quaker environment. He worked in a Quaker environment. It influenced him very profoundly. His family was all Quaker, especially after he married, and he was very close with his Quaker relatives. But he was not a member. That didn't matter so much for Quakers. They didn't really care so much whether people were sort of card-carrying members, so to speak. What they cared about is if people acted like a Quaker, and he sort of fit the bill for that in a lot of ways. So Quakers believed the following things. First of all, whereas most sort of people of the time period believed that the purpose of government was to protect the people. That was a truism. Quakers took it a little bit farther than others. They believed that the purpose of government was in facilitating organized charity. Specifically, they said for widows and orphans. And for them, widows and orphans was kind of a shorthand for anybody who was poor, sick, down on their luck, people who needed help. So they had a very sort of benevolent idea about government. They didn't think of it in terms of sort of as a necessary evil, as people like Thomas Paine talked about it. They talked about it more as in terms of a necessary good. Next was their belief that there needed to be a strong constitution. And when I say constitution, I mean sort of a small c constitution. So the unity of the people, the body of the people cohering together. Written constitutions were not the norm when Quakers came into being, and they became more prevalent later in the 18th century, 17th and 18th century. But unity for Quakers did not mean homogeneity. They actually believed that dissent was very important. So another aspect of Quaker constitutional theory was peaceful dissent. And so that people should voice their dissenting opinions. And the most extreme form that dissent should take would be civil disobedience, which means the public nonviolent breaking of unjust laws with the intent on educating the public about the injustice and changing things from the bottom up. They also believed that there should be an amendment process for written constitutions, and William Penn wrote the first constitution with an amendment clause in it. And all of this was to facilitate something that we would today call human rights. And for Quakers, this started out with religious liberty for dissenters, but it evolved into spiritual equality for women, which then evolved into civil equality for women, the freedom of Black people to be free of poverty and slavery, and rights for Indians, and humane treatment of all kinds of vulnerable and subordinated peoples, such as prisoners. So this was sort of the worldview that Dickinson was functioning in. This, however, leads us to kind of a problem that arises in the scholarship on Dickinson that we should kind of try to work to be aware of and maybe to remedy, and that's the confusion of modern labels. Liz, I was wondering if you might want to say just a little bit about applying modern political labels to historical actors.
Yeah, it's true. When you read a lot of books about the ideology of the revolution, there's a lot of labels that get used, specifically liberalism and conservatism, that you don't necessarily, that don't have the same meanings then as they do now. So and this is generalizations because, as we know, there's all sorts of nuances. These are kind of spectrum categories. But to be liberal meant to be also known, kind of radical. These were people in this point in the revolution that wanted independence. They didn't necessarily think a strong government was a good idea. They had all sorts of ideas about taxation. Whereas on the conservative side of this spectrum, I think that's, where I have read that Dickinson fell. And, of course, Jane, you'll be able to tell us a bit more about that. But people who decided that they wanted to work it out with Great Britain. They didn't necessarily think that it was time to call independence. Could we set up, a system of government that included American governance and Great British governments or some sort of thing in between? They did tend to want a stronger government. And we can see these categories of what is called liberal and conservative even shift between the revolution in 1776 to the making of the Constitution in 1786 and 1787. So Jane, when we think about these categories that scholars have applied to the founders of liberal and conservative, and now that we have a general idea of what they meant, where should we look at Dickinson on this spectrum of political ideology? Yeah,
you're absolutely right, Liz, that these labels can't really be applied. I mean, I kind of defy anybody to define liberalism or conservatism as it is today. let alone applying this to the time period we're talking about. So you're also right that most of this limited scholarship on Dickinson kind of paints him as a conservative. And one recent biography of him even calls him like the American Burke, which is really pretty off target considering that Dickinson was a fervent supporter of the French Revolution. So it's true that he, like many of his colleagues, was looking backwards to legal precedent, to history. And he was, in fact, very concerned with conserving the British Constitution, which included America. But importantly, he was not in favor of preserving the old world order, the old world social order that defined the thought of men like Burke. He looked forward to the rights that should be secured to the individual through a more robust constitution that would lift individuals up rather than keeping them down. But bearing that in mind, we would also be anachronistic if we called him a liberal, as we would mean that term today. Increasingly, as Dickinson got older, his worldview was informed by religion, specifically sort of a Quaker religion. And so his liberalism, so to speak, was not the laissez-faire kind. It was the Quaker variety. And in some ways, that was actually the opposite of laissez-faire. Now, let's move on to the articles themselves, and we can see a little bit how he thought about these things in kind of a real world situation. So Liz, would you like to sort of set the stage for us a little bit?
I thought you never asked. I'm all excited about the Articles of Confederation. I think to get an idea of Dickinson's place and role with the Articles of Confederation, we actually have to go back to June 7, 1776. So that's where I'd like to pick up the story. So we're on the eve of American independence, and Pennsylvania has sent John Dickinson to represent them in the Second Continental Congress, which means that Dickinson was likely on hand on June 7, 1776, when Richard Henry Lee of Virginia stood up in Congress and issued his famous resolution. You know, the one that says these states ought to be free or these colonies ought to be free and independent states. Well, of course, we know that particular resolution, and we really almost only know that exclusive part of the revolution. But that resolution actually had three parts. One was to draft declare independence and draft a Declaration of Independence. The second part was to form foreign alliances, because how is the United States or these colonies going to win this war if they didn't have foreign support, and especially foreign money? And the third part was to, quote, prepare and digest the form of a confederation. So this is the third part of this resolution that basically says, if we're going to be an independent country, we need to have a constitution. And what they were thinking of at that point was a confederation type of government. So they create a committee. It's supposed to contain members from all the different 13 colonies. And John Dickinson comes to head this particular committee. And the committee is charged with coming up with a constitution. And I always think it's really interesting to think of Dickinson on this committee and not some of the others committees, but he seems to be really well suited to this committee. Jane, could you tell us a bit about Dickinson's work as the head of the Confederation Committee?
Yeah, so this is kind of an interesting moment because at this point, his colleagues knew very clearly that he was against independence. And they were increasingly irritated with him for taking the stance because they felt like he had led them right up to the precipice of independence and then said, no, I'm not doing it. I mean, in actuality, all along, he was never in favor of independence, and they just sort of misinterpreted his things like the farmers' letters. So you know, he was the leader of the resistance, though, up to this point. And he was also the most respected statesman, one of the best trained lawyers in the colonies. And so even though his colleagues were disappointed that he wasn't willing to kind of take that last step with them, they knew that they still needed his help in this regard. And then there's another factor to consider, which was that actually many of them just really were much less excited about drafting a new constitution than they were about declaring independence. It was in some ways kind of an afterthought. So, it kind of actually demonstrates the fairly remarkable degree of short-sightedness, which was precisely what concerned Dickinson about declaring independence. We don't know much more about the drafting committee. There aren't many extant notes or records from this time. But I think it would be helpful if I just say a little bit about what Dickinson was bringing to this endeavor. I've talked a little bit about the theory and the abstract, and I'm going to make it a little bit more concrete. So when I talked about the Quaker idea of the strong constitution, this was probably one of the main reasons Dickinson did not want independence. He believed that the British Constitution, of which America was a part, was the thing that held the colonies together, and that he wrote in his farmers' letters, if the colonies separate, we must bleed from every vein. So he believed that America's salvation was really in its protection under the British Constitution. There were also a couple of other very sort of practical things. One was that America had no military to speak of, and it also had no foreign allies at the moment. And then the other problem was that Americans, or the colonies, were definitely not unified except through Britain. And they had these disputes, the colonies had disputes with one another that were not necessarily resolved. So for example, the Penn-Baltimore dispute over the border between Pennsylvania and Maryland had gone on for 85 years until it was just recently decided by the king in 1769. And in that same year, just as that one controversy was solved, another one arose, which was, they call it the Wyoming controversy. We talk about it today as the Pennamite-Yankee Wars. And this was the conflict between Pennsylvania settlers and Connecticut settlers in the Wyoming Valley, north, kind of south, north of the northern part of what's Pennsylvania today. So the unity was a problem. Another major issue was the Pennsylvania 1701 Charter of Privileges that the Quakers had written. This was the Constitution of Pennsylvania that gave Quakers all of their religious liberties. And challenges to this charter had gotten louder and more vehement, especially since 1764, when a group of people, including Benjamin Franklin, tried to get the charter abolished and the colony put under a royal government. Dickinson said then that they had to preserve the Constitution to protect Quakers' religious liberty. And he believed that it was these two constitutions working in concert with one another. The Pennsylvania Constitution protected the Quaker rights, and then the Pennsylvania Constitution was protected under the British Constitution. So he was very concerned about that. And it didn't help matters that just as he was drafting the Articles of Confederation, Pennsylvania was in the process of being overtaken by a radical faction. Many of these people were overtly hostile to Quaker interests and had been just sort of fanned, the flames of their hatred had been fanned by Thomas Paine, who had equated Quakers with Tories. And so he and his Quaker relatives were very concerned about Quaker, civil rights being violated, religious liberty. Another concern that he had before him at the time, another Quaker concern, was that Quakers were the only religious group in the Anglo-American world who allowed women to preach. And Dickinson was surrounded by strong Quaker women, his wife and his mother, and he welcomed their opinions on political matters, and he encouraged women to contribute their own their views on politics to the world. So this was something else he was considering. And a final issue was the matter of slavery. And so in 1772, in the versus Stewart case, it was ruled that slavery was incompatible with the British common law. And I strongly suspect that Dickinson was hoping that this ruling would have an effect on American slavery. I think he thought it would, as Southerners hoped it would not. And he referred to this ruling in a 1774 essay on the constitutional power of Great Britain. Quakers themselves they'd founded an abolition society, and they had made it against the Quaker discipline for Quakers to continue owning slaves, and they started disowning Quakers who would not own slaves or did not free their slaves. And then Dickinson himself in 1777 began freeing his own slaves, first conditionally and then unconditionally. So by 1786, he had freed all of his slaves unconditionally and became an abolitionist, and also gave his former slaves reparations. So, so all of these things were in his mind as he was writing his draft of the Articles of Confederation.
You know, Jane, I'm surprised you didn't mention Dickinson bringing his fame to the table. Because if you think about the Declaration of Independence, they have Benjamin Franklin, right? He is the most famous American out there, but Dickinson has his own fame to give this first Constitution some cachet, some gravitas. Plus, he's a brilliant writer. Have you ever thought about those contributions when you think about the Articles of Confederation?
Well, that's an interesting question. No, I haven't, or at least, well, okay, I take that back. Yes, I have. But Dickinson was really, he was not his own fan. Like he wasn't a fan of his own fame. I don't think he particularly enjoyed it, and he never used it. In fact, when he gave his final speech against independence, he began by saying, what I'm about to do will give the finishing blow to my once too great and my integrity considered now too diminished popularity. And then when he was basically voted out of Congress, he wrote to his friend Charles Thompson and said, you know, something along the lines of like, almost makes me blush to say it. No young lover is ever cast off his clothes so enthusiastically to jump into his blooming bride's bed, and as I have cast off my fame. And so he was not one to use his fame or his celebrity in that way. He was maybe a little bit too humble for that. Very much not in the mode of Franklin. But it's a really interesting point.
Yeah, you know, we don't really know a lot about how the articles were drafted. There are not a lot of official records of it. In fact, one of the things I'm trying to do in my research is I'm very curious about how it's ratified, like why people decided that they wanted to get into a perpetual union and how you overcome all of these cultural, political, and social and regional differences. But one of the really interesting documents that we do have about the articles is Dickinson's very first draft. It's, you know, in his role on the committee as the chair of the committee, he seems to have taken lead on taking everybody's ideas and his ideas and formulating them into a draft constitution. Jane, you mentioned a lot of concerns that Dickinson brought to the drafting table, you know, that there are disputes among the colonies. You have, you know, the Quakers' religious liberties that he's thinking about, women's rights, slavery. Can you tell us how he incorporated these concerns into the draft that we have in the Dickinson papers of the Articles of Confederation?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and this is where I'm going to direct readers to the material for the seminar and the reader. And Will is actually going to help me by pulling up some screenshots of the reader in case you don't have it in front of you. Hold on just a second. Let's not have it up just yet. Thank you. So his primary concern, I think, was having a strong central government, and so he wanted a strong constitution that would provide that, basically kind of a replacement for the British Constitution. in the good parts, but not the bad parts. So he wanted each state to have control over its affairs, but not to the point that it would destabilize this new union. So he wrote this, and this is where Will can bring up the pages 9 and 10 from the course reader. So he said, each state will have control over its own affairs. And he said, in all matters that shall not interfere with the articles of this confederation. This was really a key point. It seems small, it's just a few words here, but this was, I think, a central component, and that he thought would help preserve the Union. In addition to this, he also said that the central government could raise and deploy troops within a state without the approval or permission of that state. And that's, kind of a maybe a timely issue right now. He also said that states could not make treaties with each other. And he also said that states could not discriminate against inhabitants of other states, especially in trade. So we see him starting to, well, actually, I believe he really started thinking about this problem of like a sovereignty within a sovereignty, or a state within a state, as early as the 1750s and 60s. And so here we see him struggling with it again. How do we deal with a central government with subordinate state governments? Well, they need to be subordinate. That's sort of the key here. Another thing he was concerned most about was the issue of individual rights. And so one thing that we actually see in Ben Franklin's version of the Articles of Confederation in 1775 was protection of Indian rights. In this way, his version is not very different at all from Franklin's version. He believed that there needed to be an alliance with 6 nations with their land secured to them. And he also wanted people, basically ambassadors, living among the Indians to protect their interests. This basically was a long-standing Quaker concern of good relations with Native Americans that stretched back all the way to the founding of Pennsylvania. Another key issue for him, as we've talked about before, was religious liberty. What he did here, he had a provision where, and you can see it on the same page that Will is on right now, where he says, no person in any colony living peaceably under the civil government. This was a provision for religious liberty that basically froze in place all of the current laws on religion in each colony, so that they couldn't start passing new laws that would infringe on religious liberty any more than it was already curtailed. What his provision did here was it kind of anticipated, to look farther down the road, it anticipated both the First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution and the 14th Amendment. So giving religious liberty, protecting religious liberty, and making it applicable to the states. Then, in the most really remarkable provision, in his notes, so he had this draft, but he also had notes to this draft. He did the following thing. The notes were called Hints of a Confederation. And so let's turn to page 7 of the reader. So what he did here was he said, no person or person living peaceably under any government shall be molested or prejudiced in, then he wrote his or their, and then he crossed out his or their and wrote his or her persons or a state for his or her religious persuasion, and he went on. This is, as far as I'm aware, the first time that any gender inclusive language had been written into an Anglo-American constitution, and when it concerned a basic freedom. So this is really remarkable. And then from then on, he used this gender inclusive language. And this is remarkable, not just because he's using this gender inclusive language to say that women's religious liberty ought to be protected. If you look down a little farther in that clause, he talks specifically about the practice of religion. What he means here is that Quaker women practice their religion by preaching publicly. So he wanted to make sure that women had not just the freedom of religion to worship, but they could speak publicly about their religion. So this is the first time we see women given the, with their rights protected for religious liberty and public speech. And now most women at the time would not even have, it wouldn't even have occurred to them that they had this liberty. But here Dickinson was, this is at the same time that Abigail Adams was begging her husband to remember the ladies when they were declaring independence because men are tyrants. And John Adams laughed at his wife and called her saucy. And as Adams is laughing at Abigail, Dickinson is actually writing in protections for his wife into this new Constitution. Then another issue that it doesn't come up as much as we might like to see is the issue of slavery. And I inadvertently omitted this part from the reader, but I'll have Will put up a slide. So in a query on one of the later drafts, Dickinson, he basically asked his colleagues, he says, should not there be an article to prevent those who are hereafter brought into these colonies from being held in slavery within these colonies? And I think the reason why he didn't actually write an anti-slavery clause into his draft of the Articles of Confederation was that I think he was absolutely certain that if anything would get cut out, it would be that. And so he just wrote this query, and of course it didn't go anywhere. But this is not an indication of his own personal opinion on slavery, which we know he acted on this, but certainly it was not entertained at all by his colleagues. So just to summarize here, what we have in these documents, and as Liz mentioned, they're really the only documents that we have from this time. Dickinson's vision of the Union was really quite interesting. So he considered the rights of individuals. He believed that states ought to be restrained and subordinated, but not consolidated or obliterated. And he was perhaps inching towards a solution for representation, that each state got one vote in Congress, but then the quote, I think this is really interesting, the quotas of expenses that would be paid into the common treasury, and this is on page 15 of the reader, these quotas would be assessed proportionally based on the entire population. Yeah, Will, you can go ahead and scroll down to page 15. Yeah, there you go. So that, we have, I don't know, this, I'm just kind of throwing this out there, that we might have the beginnings of this, the dual representation of, one vote for each state plus a proportional representation. But we're definitely going to be talking about this in our next session on the Constitutional Convention. So that is sort of the big summary of Dickinson's contributions to the Articles. And
what I find so fascinating about this, right, is that we can see a lot of what Dickinson wanted ended up in the Constitution of 1787 or later in amendments to the Constitution. So it always seems to me like Dickinson was a little bit ahead of his time. But so we know Dickinson writes this draft that includes women. It advocates for a strong central government. It has, this language on emoluments. And then—
I forgot the emoluments.
Oh, you did?
I did.
Oh, I opened the door for that. Do you want to talk
Let me just say really quickly then. And I can't claim this is my own discovery, and it's still in the process of being researched. So, law professor at Georgetown Law School, John McHale, he contacted me looking for some proof of a suspicion that he had that John Dickinson was actually he provided the origins for the emoluments clause in the Constitution, and here we don't have this in Franklin's draft, but we do have this mention of no emoluments. No public servant should be allowed to receive any emoluments for holding office, especially from a prince or a foreign state. And so yes, the emoluments issue was one I didn't want to lose track of, but I sure did. So thanks for bringing me back to that. So yes, please continue.
Yeah, so as we said, Dickinson hands Congress this draft, the committee of this draft, that there'll be a strong central government. He queries on the issue of slavery. He includes, both genders in his language. And then he has these clauses that if you work for the government, you should do so without pay.
Without pay, but without emoluments from foreign states.
So I don't know, in my head, I like to imagine John Dickinson taking his draft that he's worked so hard on. We don't have any evidence for this, but this is how I picture it in my mind. And he hands it to the rest of the committee and his colleagues, excited about his work, but a bit trepidatious to get their feedback on it. And then we have a little bit of smattering about reception of this document. Like Jane, I think you found a letter between Edward Rutledge and John Jay on June 29, 1776. It kind of gives us a flavor of what his fellow colleagues in the Congress were thinking about.
Yeah, do you have that quote in front of you?
I actually don't. I was hoping that
it must have gotten purged from our notes, right? So Edward Rutledge wrote to John Jay. He was obviously annoyed and frustrated, and he said, well, I'm paraphrasing obviously, but so he said, this production has the vice of all of Dickinson's writings, which is that of refining too much. And I think that's hilarious, because of all the times you want to refine, it's when you're writing a constitution for a perpetual union. But he didn't like this, and he was annoyed by it, and so he sort of slammed Dickinson on that.
And then the committee slammed him too, I guess, in a way, because they went through and slashed every provision that gave the Confederation Congress, internal and big authority. They really wanted a document that left to the states to have more power than the central government. And I always wondered, Jane, do you have anything, from your knowledge of John Dickinson's papers, any sort of reaction from Dickinson on what he felt when they really gutted his draft of the Articles?
Unfortunately, no. I think it wasn't gutted immediately. It was sort of gutted in stages, and it wasn't even, fully gutted when it was presented to Congress. So it was presented to Congress on July 12th, and that's the same day that Dickinson left Philadelphia and traveled to New Jersey to the front and joined his battalion as colonel of it was the 1st Philadelphia Battalion of Associators. So, he wasn't there to defend his work. And I have not yet found any particular thing where he says, oh, I can't believe that they, eviscerated my draft. He found the Confederation very problematic. But I don't know. He was also angry that he didn't resign. The radical government basically appointed new delegates to Congress, so he was ousted, and he was angry about that. But no, I don't have anything on the Articles in particular. But it's unfortunate that he left, and maybe if he'd been in Congress, or at least in Philadelphia, there would have been an advocate for his view. But on the other hand, I think it's very plausible that it wouldn't have passed the way he wrote it, regardless. So I think America just wasn't quite in that place.
And I do think we need to talk about the place that America's in, and I want to speculate. I'll have a better answer, I hope, after going into local archives and looking through papers, but just kind of speculate as to why there isn't a lot of documentation on this. When we think of the Articles of Confederation, we need to think of it as something that was written during wartime. And when you read the journals of the Continental Congress, you can see that they're talking about the war all the time. And that was what's really important. We're also in this moment, too, where the states have to come up with their own government. So at the very moment that the Second Continental Congress is trying to draft a constitution of government, they're at their home states trying to figure out how they want to structure their own government. And one of the things that I think you can see consistently in all of these different documents, the 13 different state constitutions that will eventually emerge during the Revolution, and in the final version of the Articles of Confederation, is this fear of a strong central government. And I think that makes sense when you look at this as a document of the revolution, right? You had years of protests over taxation when Great Britain was really trying to rein in and consolidate power of its colonies and consolidate its power over its colonies. So people tend to be a bit wary over having too much power. And if you are going to give a government so much power, where do you want that power? You want it as close to you as possible. So the best place to put that, as many people thought, obviously not Dickinson, was in the place of the states. There was this move with the Articles of Confederation to have the states have more power. But Jane, I think we also have to acknowledge that when they send this document out to be ratified on November 15th, 1777, and it doesn't get ratified until March 1st, 1781, that this document doesn't seem to be, a super priority for Americans. Just the way that they're debating it and trying to figure out how to ratify it. Again, that's part of my larger research, and I'm still in the early stages of this project. So I'd like to find out more about that. But I think you can just see from the timeline that war and other issues seem to be more on Americans' minds and setting up some of these governments.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And, it's very true that, they had just gotten out from, under this thing what they perceive to be a tyrannical government, and they certainly don't want to put themselves right back into that situation. But, I think Dickinson was looking at it more in terms of the government's misbehaving and there's absolutely some problems with it that need to be solved. But the Constitution, the British Constitution, at root was good. It was salutary. It lasted for thousands of years, and it was not something that should just be thrown away without something similar to replace it. And as it turns out, most of Dickinson's fears for the new republic that he kind of expressed through his draft of the Articles of Confederation were justified, as many difficulties that he predicted for the Union and for individuals came to pass. So I'm just going to say a little bit about the sort of timeline of events that highlight these things after independence, and this also goes to show that although a lot of scholars kind of have Dickinson sort of fading off into retirement and not really playing an active role after independence, this certainly shows that he was very active. So he went off to the front in the summer of '76, and then by September, his unit had fallen apart with desertions like many other units. So he came back to Pennsylvania, to Philadelphia, and he was immediately reelected to the assembly there. But the problem was he very strenuously objected to the radical new 1776 Constitution that was put forth by the radicals. And so he took a seat in assembly, but he tried to amend the Constitution, and the radicals wouldn't go for it. So he ended up abdicating his seat in the assembly, and he took all of his supporters with him, which denied the radicals a quorum. And so the government basically fell apart, and martial law was declared in Philadelphia. He then, that caused him to be pursued as an enemy of the state by the radicals, and his response was in part to join the Delaware militia as a private. He did something that no other leading founder did. He enlisted as a private, and in order to, you know, help his state and to demonstrate his patriotism. So then, while he was enlisted as a private, one of the biggest travesties of the revolution took place, and that was in 1777 through 78. A group of Quakers were rounded up by the revolutionary leadership and exiled to Virginia, and they were denied habeas corpus. They were never given any kind of hearing. They were never presented with charges, and they were held for, I think it was 9 months, without any due process whatsoever. And the problem was that there was no constitution in place that would protect them. And so the government of Pennsylvania and the Congress just kind of bounced their cause back and forth between the two of them, and everyone could just say, it's, you know, not our problem, go talk to the other government. And so this was a massive violation of religious liberty and, you know, persecution of dissenters. And these were Dickinson's relatives who were rounded up like this. Then in 1779, Dickinson came back into Congress as a delegate from Delaware, and for a year he worked for peace with Great Britain. Then in 1781 to 82, he was president of Delaware, and he really transformed the state from a failing state to a flourishing state and a model of a new kind of state government. He sort of reformed all of the judiciary and the finances and the militia, and really, you know, did a lot of really good work to put Delaware on a firm footing. Before he was even done doing that, he was elected president of Pennsylvania, so he held this position for a time simultaneous. He was the only person I know of who was president of two states simultaneously. And during this time, he dealt with myriad issues that arose from the problems of the Confederacy, I should say the Confederation. So one of the earliest things was the Mutiny of 1783, where it was sort of the trickle down from the Newburgh Conspiracy, where a group of Continental soldiers, they threatened to march on Philadelphia, and they threatened the Congress. And Congress wanted Dickinson to call out the militia, and Dickinson refused because he thought it could be solved peacefully. And actually, he went out and talked to them and put it down. And it resolved. Ironically, if his version of the Articles had passed, Congress could have called out troops to suppress the uprising themselves. But you know, there's an issue of power. There was the ongoing problems of the Wyoming controversy. So the Third Pennamite War started in 1784, and it was sort of solved by Congress. It was only the only border dispute that Congress did try to solve, and they gave it to Pennsylvania. But the controversy went on for another, you know, until 1799. And then there were also problems with taxation. Dickinson was constantly trying to get Pennsylvania to pay its taxes to the Confederation government. So, you know, all these things were brewing, and he was talking with his friends and his colleagues, trying to sort out what exactly needed to happen. And things like this were happening around the states, weren't they, Liz?
Yeah, a lot of the issues you're talking about were writ large across the states. Like they may not have had those exact problems, but they had very similar problems. So after the War for Independence ends in 1783, people are excited about it, but then you have a post-war economy and depression in that economy, and that's because of a couple different factors, right? You know, the United States had been members of the British Empire with all of the British Empire's protections and markets that they could access. And now as an independent nation, they couldn't. So they were having trouble accessing markets in the Caribbean that they often traded with. They were having big disputes over Western land, especially in the Ohio River Valley. So, you know, you see a lot of conflict with Native Americans that the new government is having to conflicts between Native Americans and settlers who were coming in and settling on their lands. So you had the new United States trying to sort out those problems. you had things like trying to navigate the diplomacy needed to secure the ability to trade along the Mississippi River, which Spain was not willing to give up freely. And then you had, events like that we know about, like Shays' Rebellion, which is also a taxation issue, as you were just mentioning, where people in Eastern Massachusetts said, okay, if we're going to retire our war debt, then we need to raise taxes, and you're going to have to pay us in specie or hard coin and not just IOUs and different crops and things like that. And so courts were getting shut down all over Massachusetts, and they actually had to send the army in to quash that rebellion. So there are a lot of problems going on that the national government seems ill-equipped to deal with. In fact, when you read a lot of histories of the Constitution where they set out, well, why did we have a Constitution? They often treat the Articles of Confederation as kind of a stepping stone for that. Like, there were lots of problems. But we just have to remember, I think, an important part is that there wasn't inevitably going to be the Constitution of 1787, that this was the government that they had under the Articles of Confederation. And they were trying to figure out how they could use this Constitution, the Articles, to solve these problems that they're experiencing. And not a surprise, because we've gotten to know a fair bit about John Dickinson, he becomes one of the leaders of this movement to try to figure out, how do you get the national government to help deal with all these unforeseen problems?
Right. So, they started planning the Annapolis Convention in the spring of 1786, and in September they gathered there. It was a small group. They were hoping for representatives from all the states, but there were only 12 representatives from 5 states, and they gathered in Mann's Tavern in Annapolis to discuss ideas for how to fix the structure. But really, they were fairly restricted to trade issues, and they knew right away that there were more matters to be discussed than just trade. And when they met, they immediately voted Dickinson to be the president or the chairman. And I think it's just really interesting that this person who wrote the first draft of the Articles of Confederation is now the person leading the movement to change them. And they really did believe that they were just going to amend the Articles of Confederation. And so they met and really more or less decided only that they couldn't do anything. And we don't have very many records from this either. So we don't know a whole lot about what went on. There is disagreement among documentary editors about who wrote the report. Some will say that Hamilton wrote it, but we really only have Madison's recollection from many, many years after the fact, saying like, well, it must have been Hamilton who wrote that. But Dickinson wasn't one to just slap his name on documents. He was usually a very active draftsman. If he didn't write the first draft, then he jumped in and edited very heavily. So I think it's fair to say that this is at least a co-authored document rather than just a Hamilton authored document, or even just a Dickinson authored document. So he wrote this report, and then come the following year on February 21st, I believe it was, 21st or 22nd, Congress read Dickinson's letter calling for a constitutional convention that would meet in May in Philadelphia. And that is going to be the subject of our next session on November 4th, when I'm sure we'll all want to talk about the Constitution and the convention on, I don't know, issues like the power of the executive and maybe even the Electoral College. So we'll have a lot on our minds on November 4th. I think at this point it's time for us to open up the session to questions from the audience. So I guess I'll kick it over to Will and let you moderate.
Excellent. Well, thank you for that. Both of you did such a lovely job. I learned so much just listening to you two, and I'm sure that that's a sentiment shared by many of our participants here. If you have a question, Again, the best way to pose it would be through the Q&A thread. I'm going to do my best to get through these, but I'm going to sort of crowdsource the responsibility a bit. So if you look in the Q&A thread and you see a question that you would also really like to see answered, you could upvote it by clicking the little thumbs up sign, and that will sort of push it to the top of the queue so that I can get to the questions in our limited time that are sort of the most widely shared. So to that end, I'd like to start with Richard Evans, who asks, what was Dickinson's view of Joseph Galloway's plan of union?
I have not found anything that where Dickinson speaks specifically to that, and I wish I knew more, because what's interesting here is that before John Adams was Dickinson enemy number one, it was Joseph Galloway, and these two men hated each other with a white-hot fury, to the point that he even got into a fist fight. And Galloway had spent a lot of time trying to keep Dickinson out of office. And so, okay, so you want to kind of say, oh, he must have hated it. I don't know that that's necessarily true. I think he would have thought that it was very flawed, and that it gave, too much power to the British government, and that was not where Dickinson was. On the other hand, it was an attempt to try to solve the problems and keep America unified with Britain. So I think he would have appreciated that, in spite of it coming from Galloway. But the fact that Dickinson would have spoken up for something if he thought it was a viable solution, regardless of who it came from, and that he didn't suggest that he didn't think it was a viable solution. So we kind of have to let the silence speak for itself in this case. But it's a great question.
Absolutely. We have another one from Carrie Bryan, who writes, John Dickinson represents Delaware, then Pennsylvania, or yes, he represents Delaware, then Pennsylvania, then Delaware, etc. Did he physically relocate his household each time, or were the relationship lines between Pennsylvania and Delaware so permeable because the three counties that became Delaware colony were originally southern parts of Pennsylvania that he could toggle between these political entities?
Yeah, you got it. That's absolutely right. I mean, there's even a book by Monroe, I think, called Philadelphians or something like that. And so, yes, there were a number of figures like Thomas McCain and George Reed, who did just, they had a residence in both places. And so Dickinson, he always kept his house in Kent. And yet, he had more than one house in Pennsylvania, in Philadelphia, and then he only finally permanently relocated to Wilmington, Delaware, in 1785. But until then, yes, he was back and forth, equally, kind of representing both colonies and then the states. But yeah, so you really nailed it. Yeah.
Excellent. David Kozla writes, John Minor Botts, the Unionist in Richmond, Virginia, wrote in his memoir, The Late Rebellion, that the Articles of Confederation used the word perpetual to describe the revolutionary combination of the 13 states. The question whether the Constitution created an obligation of perpetuity is, of course, central to the disputes leading to the Civil War. Do the papers of Dickinson reflect any discussion of how the, quote, more perfect union could be dissolved?
You said be dissolved?
Be dissolved, yes.
Oh, no. Quakers, Dickinson really adopted this tenet of Quaker thinking, that the Constitution was perpetual. And that's why, I believe, one reason why he and Quakers were so opposed to the Revolution, because the Revolution destroyed the Constitution. And they believed that that you could always fix it from within, especially when you had an amendment process, or if you didn't have the amendment process, then you use civil disobedience. But it was never acceptable. They didn't absolutely. This is why it bugs me so much when people say, "Oh, well, Quakers were just." They were just radical Puritans, or they were just a kind of Puritan. That's not true at all. Puritans had the theory of revolution. and Quakers did not. And they had the theory of civil disobedience. So no, Dickinson said, no, we've got this amendment process, and we can always improve it. There's always something we can do, and now, I mean, that said, I suppose he would say, like, you know, if everybody sort of got together and peacefully decided that they wanted to dissolve it, that might be another matter. But when we're talking about violence or a unilateral decision, then absolutely not. It would have to be a peaceful process. But I think he would have warned against that as well. It's a great question.
Gus Widmer writes, prior to the Constitutional Convention period, what was Dickinson's relationship with James Wilson?
So James Wilson was Dickinson's law clerk. Dickinson was his mentor. And unfortunately, we have very little extant correspondence between the two men because they lived in the same city and probably saw each other frequently. That doesn't mean they agreed on everything. They did disagree on things in the Constitutional Convention. We can talk about that next time. But yeah, Dickinson was Wilson's mentor.
Excellent. All right, so we've got a close reader here. Sally Haddon brings us back to the text. On page 10 of the seminar reading in the Article of Confederation draft, an article Dickinson drafted protects freedom of conscience and religious practices. Interestingly, this article was dropped, she notes. Is the language in the article similar to, as in sounds like, organized like, the language already used in Pennsylvania colonial documents? Or is it drafted in Dickinson's words and phrasing, thus revealing more about his views of religion?
So it's a little hard for me. I don't have these things open in front of me, but what I will say is that in his notes, the notes that he wrote prior to the draft, I believe it's in Hints of a Confederation, and if not, I might not have included it. I'm not sure. I'd have to go back and look. But he said specifically that he would be drawing on Pennsylvania documents in order to craft this. So he was very, very consciously, modeling what he wrote in the Articles of Confederation on practices in Pennsylvania. Now, whether he departed from that and how he did that, I would have to sit down and look at those two things side by side to see if I could parse it out. But I can tell you that he was very clearly and consciously modeling what he wrote there on the Pennsylvania documents.
Great. Bob Wong writes, did Dickinson support the right to vote and to own property by women, Blacks, and Native Americans, despite his abolitionist belief? Did he believe in a separation of races, such as support for colonization of Africa by Blacks?
Yeah, again, I have not found anything about voting by these groups. I think he can't have had a problem with women owning property and sort of fulfilling robust roles in society. Before he married his wife, she managed all the property that she owned that came to her in her father's will. Her cousin was his property manager, Hannah Griffiths. But I haven't found anything about voting. I haven't found anything with Indians. It's a little different, because they had their own nation, and he certainly was concerned about preserving their rights. And one thing that is interesting that I can say is that although he was an abolitionist, he seems to have adopted the Quaker view of the role of Black people in that, make them free, set them up for success. He was in favor of educating Black children. So set them up for success, but don't necessarily keep them too close. This is a very common Quaker view. I've never seen that he was in favor of colonization, but there does seem to be a place in the Delaware Constitutional Convention of 1791-92, where he voted against Blacks owning property in Delaware, which really confuses me. I don't understand his position on that, because he was, he was giving reparations and really encouraging Black people in Delaware. So I don't know, that's sort of a big unknown. But yeah, we do have that hint that he may have been opposed to Blacks owning property, but not in favor necessarily of colonization. He definitely wanted, saw slavery as an intestine ill that needed to be rooted out, but not that Blacks needed necessarily to be, relocated out of the states.
Excellent. So we actually have a couple of comments, one from James Kabbalah, another from Charlene Shehorn, both praising you for an excellent seminar. Certainly, Charlene has a sort of follow-up here. Could you tell me more about his relatives that were rounded up? Very curious.
Yes, so the Pembertons, they were his relatives by marriage. James Pemberton, and I think Israel was he dead by that point? I'm losing track of my people here. But yes, James Pemberton was one of the ones rounded up, and he was a relation by marriage, but someone with whom Dickinson was very close. And again, this is a situation where I haven't found anything specifically where he talks about this, in part because he was, in Philadelphia when this was going on, and actually he had to move his family out on an emergency basis because the British were coming, and they came in, they burnt his estate, and he was worried about his wife and his daughter, so he had to rush them out of Pennsylvania down to Kent as quickly as he could. But yeah, James Pemberton was seen as one of the leaders of the Quakers, and someone who was very opposed to independence. And so he was really cast as an enemy of the American cause and a Tory, and he wasn't either one of those things. But the Quakers really had this blowback against them. But yeah, James Pemberton was his relative, and then I'm not sure if he had other more distant relatives in that group, but that will be, sort of a subject for future research. But great question. Thanks, Charlene.
Jason Mandras asks, was there any out-of-state founder, I guess it's in founding father, that Dickinson was particularly impressed with?
Was there an out-of-state?
An out-of-state founding father that Dickinson was particularly impressed with.
So
what's that?
Not of Pennsylvania or Delaware.
Right. So he was, a big fan of James Otis, Samuel Adams. He didn't really. John Adams didn't really have a colony-wide reputation before he came down there, and at that point, Adams was more like Dickinson's fanboy. And so, but Dickinson certainly really admired the Massachusetts revolutionary leadership, and he was also in contact. He was Richard Henry Lee, Arthur Lee, Christopher Gadsden. Again, no one really knew Thomas Jefferson or Madison or Hamilton, those youngsters. And so yeah, the sort of the people you would imagine who were prominent leaders before independence. He was certainly in contact with all of them and admired them a great deal.
Great. Michael Hagg asks, did the Articles of Confederation have a markup in the entire Congress similar to what was done with the Declaration of Independence?
Do you want to take that one, Liz?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I have a better answer than you do. I have not found one. It's not in the journals of the Continental Congress, and I haven't found people talking about it yet. With that said, I still have a ton of research to do. I really think that we'll find out more about the Articles of Confederation, how they were drafted, how they were ratified, when we dig into specific people's papers, which are scattered, of course, probably in more places than just the Eastern Seaboard. But I haven't read about it in a secondary source yet. The best secondary source on the Articles of Confederation and its makeup is by Merrill Jensen. It's called the Articles of Confederation, and I think it was written in 1945. But that is the last book I have found that treats the Articles of Confederation on its own terms and not associated with the Constitution. So if you're interested in more about that, I would definitely check out Jensen's book.
So two things really quickly. I'd prefer Jack Rakove's The Beginning of National Politics. That one is really, really terrific. It's very detailed. It gives a lot of attention to Dickinson's draft and really kind of picks things apart. So, and the reason I prefer that to Jensen is Jensen has this, it's old. I mean, you noted it was in the 40s that it was published. And Jensen takes this very sort of dated view that, of Dickinson as a conservative and not, forward looking at all. And so I don't know, I think Rakove's work is much more, it does a better job. So there's that. As far as markup goes, so Dickinson's draft went through several iterations. So there was his first draft, and then there was, I think, a cleaner draft. There was Josiah Bartlett's draft, and then there was a committee draft as well. And in one of the drafts, I think the committee draft, we have notes on it from Charles Thompson. So all of these drafts are going to be published in a volume of the Dickinson writings. I think that's going to be maybe volume 6. We're on volume 2, so it's going to be a few years. But if anybody is interested in this stuff in particular, I can give scholars or researchers access to documents that aren't going to be available to the public for a while, including these multiple drafts. But then once it actually gets to Congress, and goes into the 1777 iteration, I lose track of it a little bit after that.
All right, so we have 6 minutes, and I want to propose a lightning round where we tackle 3 questions in 6 minutes, 2 minutes per question. Think we can manage that, Jane?
We'll try.
We'll try. All right. Rob Haberman writes, how did Dickinson's views regarding the rights of women influence how he raised his daughters and the education that they were provided?
Yeah, so very quickly, at one point, I think it was Benjamin Rush wrote to Dickinson and said, hey, dude, aren't you gonna write your memoirs? And he said, oh, well, no, why would I? I only have daughters. And of course, that's a nod to the fact that people normally wrote their political memoirs for sons who were going to be politicians, and he did not see that in the cards for his daughters. But I don't think that means, I think he raised his daughters first and foremost to be religiously devout. But I think he also, sought their advice. He credits his elder daughter, Sally, with turning him towards Quakerism, because he said, hey, Sally, and I'm not going to do the plain speech, would you like to take dancing lessons? And she said, I'm not really sure. And he said, go away and think about it. And she came back to him and she said, Father, I'd rather be a friend. And he said that just amazed him and started him down the path of Quakerism. So I think he saw his daughters as, women who could teach him something, and he was very close with them. I haven't read as much of the correspondence between him and his daughters as I would like to eventually. So more to come.
All right, Nathan Kozukanik writes, the utter insanity and complexity of Pennsylvania's pre-revolution politics indicates that, as you say, conservative and liberal are insufficient terms when writing about this time. What is the alternative? How do we get away from the left-right patriot-Tory dichotomy and still write coherently?
Darn you, Nate. I don't know. That's a great question. It's very difficult. I mean, I'm going to just say the only thing we can do is historical education. And so people, Americans know that every label has a historical context, and you can't just use these interchangeably. You can't say, for example, that the Republican Party today is the party of Lincoln. That doesn't make sense. There's so many changes in between now and then. And so I don't know that I mean, I end up using short term, air quotes and other words, but I don't know. That's a great question. I think it's an issue that all historians writing on political history face. And I don't know, maybe it's a cop-out answer, but education.
All right, Dee Andrews, thanks you for a wonderful presentation. Both you, Jane, and Liz, our special guest. This has been wonderful. She has a question that dovetails with Sally Haddon's. She writes, I see that Dickinson uses the words supreme being and Christian religion in his initial notes following the 1701 charter, and then drops them in favor of generic references to, quote, religious persuasion and the like in the hints. Do you think that that's significant, that being more generic would be necessary in a religiously diverse nation?
That's a really interesting question. So as we have indexed the volume 1 of Dickinson's writings, he uses all these different terms for God. Sometimes he uses God, but more often it's the divine presence or supreme being, and so he uses these things. And I'm not sure how loaded the terms would have been. Those are fairly generic. But I think certainly, he was sensitive to the fact that there was an incredible amount of religious diversity in early America, and he especially, I think, did not want people to see him as a Quaker, in that he didn't want to be seen as being controlled by Quakers. So if he backed away from some of that language, it might have been to sort of preserve his appearance as someone who was an independent of any religious body. I don't know. I'd like to think more about that, and because it's a really interesting question and kind of gets into the whole issue of what does religious liberty mean in 1776 or 1789. So anyway, yeah, a great question.
And in that spirit, to the 18 other question posers that we didn't get to, first of all, mea culpa, but second, understand that this is the beginning of a 3-session seminar, so we'll continue on this learning process. And I certainly encourage you to pose your questions again where they're relevant, and we'll do our best to get to them in future sessions. So with that, thank you, Jane. Thank you, Liz. This was a wonderful start to what I am sure is going to be a fascinating seminar.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
And to the rest of you, thank you for joining, giving a little bit of your Wednesday evening over to the Library Company. We have a number of other events queued up for the following days and weeks. Check out librarycompany.org/events, but most importantly, keep the next session on your radar. It'll be exactly 2 weeks from now, Wednesday the 4th, and 5:30 to 7, same time, same place. I look forward to seeing you all again.
Same here. Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.